Is it wrong to pray the same thing every day? Because lately, every time you come back to God with the same burden, part of you feels ashamed. You ask again for peace, again for clarity, again for the fear to leave. And when nothing changes immediately, you start wondering if heaven is tired of hearing your voice. So now you hesitate before praying. You overthink your own prayers. You try to sound strong while silently falling apart inside. But if God already knows what you need, why does your heart keep running back to Him anyway? You have probably wondered about this more times than you want to admit. Not out loud. Not during church. Not during the moments when your faith feels strong. But late at night, when the room is quiet and your thoughts refuse to rest, the question returns again. Does God get tired of hearing the same prayer? Because you have prayed about this before. Many times before. Maybe hundreds of times. You ask God to heal the relationship, but the distance is still there. You asked Him to calm your anxious mind, but the fear keeps returning when the lights go out and the distractions fade away. You've prayed for direction, clarity, provision, healing, peace, breakthrough, and still part of your life feels suspended in silence. At first, you prayed with confidence. You believed something would happen quickly. You believed your prayer would move mountains immediately because that is what faith was supposed to look like. You brought your requests to God sincerely, honestly, hopefully, but time passed and the prayers stayed the same. That is where the quiet discouragement began to grow. Not necessarily because you stopped believing in God, but because you started questioning yourself. Maybe the problem is not the situation anymore. Maybe the problem is you. You begin wondering if repeating the same prayer means you lack faith. You wonder if spiritually mature people simply pray once and move on while you keep circling around the same fear, the same burden, the same ache in your heart. You hear phrases like, leave it in God's hands, and secretly wonder if you have failed because you keep picking the burden back up again. So every time the prayer returns to your lips, guilt comes with it. You almost hesitate before praying again. God, it's me again. And maybe you never say it directly, but deep inside there is this fear that God must be frustrated with you by now, that maybe heaven has already heard enough, that maybe your repeated prayers sound more like doubt than trust. Because if you truly trusted God, wouldn't you stop asking? That thought becomes exhausting. You start monitoring your own prayers. Instead of speaking freely, you become self-conscious before God. Instead of running toward Him honestly, you begin filtering your emotions, trying to sound more faithful than you really feel. You tell yourself not to mention the issue again. You try to suppress the burden. You try to act spiritually strong. But unresolved pain does not disappear simply because you ignore it. The burden always returns. And when it does, the internal battle begins all over again. Part of you wants to keep praying because you have nowhere else to go. But another part of you feels ashamed for still needing to pray about the same thing. So you live caught between dependence and discouragement. You'll pray. Then you feel guilty for praying again. Then you try to stop praying about it. Then the fear returns. Then you bring it back to God once more. It becomes a cycle. And the hardest part is that nobody else fully sees this internal exhaustion. From the outside, your life may appear normal. You may still smile, work, attend church, speak kindly, continue functioning. But internally, there is a quiet weariness that builds when heaven feels silent for too long. You begin measuring time differently, not by months or years, but by prayers. Another prayer without an answer. Another night carrying the same fear. Another morning wondering if anything is changing at all. Sometimes you even question whether God is listening in the same way He once did. Not because you want to doubt Him, but because repeated silence can slowly affect the human heart. You start replaying every possible reason for why the answer has not come. Maybe you prayed incorrectly. Maybe your faith is too weak. Maybe God said no. Maybe you are being ignored. Maybe you should stop asking altogether. And what makes this even heavier is that you genuinely want to trust God. This is not rebellion. This is not pride. You are not trying to control God. You are simply tired of hurting. That is what makes repeated prayers so emotional. It is rarely just about the request itself. Behind repeated prayers are repeated fears, repeated disappointments, repeated uncertainty, repeated moments where you are trying to hold yourself together while still believing God is good. Sometimes the prayer itself becomes smaller than the emotional weight behind it. You are not only asking for circumstances to change anymore, you are asking for relief, for reassurance, for hope, for strength to keep going one more day without letting fear completely take over your mind. And maybe that is why this question matters so deeply. Because if God is tired of hearing your repeated prayers, then where are you supposed to go with the pain that keeps returning? Your mind returns to it because your heart is still carrying it. The anxiety comes back because the uncertainty still exists. The prayer repeats because the wound still aches. The request returns because the waiting season has not ended. But somewhere along the way, many people began believing that bringing the same burden to God repeatedly is evidence of weak faith, as if true trust means emotional detachment, as if mature believers no longer struggle with recurring fears, recurring thoughts, recurring burdens, yet your actual experience feels very different. Because no matter how many times you try to just trust God, your heart still longs to talk to Him about the thing that hurts. And maybe what confuses you most is this: why would your heart continue returning to prayer if prayer itself was wrong? Why does something inside you still reach toward God? Even after disappointment, even after waiting, even after silence, there is something deeper happening beneath your exhaustion. But right now, you may not see it clearly. Right now, all you feel is the tension between faith and frustration, trust and fear, hope and disappointment, persistence and shame. You love God, but you are tired. You trust Him, but you are confused. You keep praying, but part of you wonders whether you should stop bringing the same request before Him altogether. And maybe the greatest struggle is not even the unanswered prayer itself. Maybe the greatest struggle is wondering what your repeated prayer says about you. Does it reveal faith or failure? That question sits quietly in the heart of many believers for years. And until it is answered correctly, prayer itself can begin to feel heavy instead of safe. But what if something about this entire struggle has been misunderstood from the beginning? One of the most common misunderstandings about faith is the belief that trust means silence after the first prayer. Many people quietly assume that spiritually mature believers pray once, surrender everything immediately, and never bring the issue up again. So when the same burden keeps returning to your heart, you start feeling like you are failing some invisible spiritual standard. You tell yourself, if I really trusted God, I wouldn't still be asking. But notice how heavy that belief becomes. Because if that were true, then every recurring fear would automatically become proof of weak faith. Every returning concern would become evidence that your trust is broken. And suddenly prayer becomes less about relationship with God and more about trying to prove emotional stability to Him. That pressure can quietly damage the way you approach God. Instead of honesty, you begin offering edited versions of yourself. You stop bringing your real emotions because you are afraid they make you look spiritually immature. You try to appear calm even when your mind feels overwhelmed. You try to sound confident even when uncertainty is exhausting you internally. But God has never asked you to pretend before Him. The truth is, the human heart naturally returns to unresolved pain. That is not spiritual weakness. That is part of being human. When something deeply matters to you, your mind revisits it. Your emotions revisit it. Your fears revisit it. And because your heart revisits it, your prayers revisit it too. You do not repeatedly pray because God forgets. You repeatedly pray because you remember. You remember the uncertainty. You remember the ache. You remember the waiting. You remember how badly you need God in the middle of all this. And maybe this is where many people misunderstand persistent prayer completely. They see repetition and assume unbelief. But what if repeated prayer is often the opposite? What if returning to God again and again is actually evidence that despite all your confusion and fear, you still believe He is the only place your soul can truly go? Think about that carefully. Even after disappointment, you still pray. Even after silence, you still turn toward God. Even after nights filled with anxiety, something inside you still reaches for him again. That does not sound like rebellion. That sounds like dependence. But dependence feels uncomfortable to human pride. Part of us wants to appear emotionally. We want one powerful prayer to remove every fear permanently so we never have to wrestle again. Yet life rarely works that way. The burdens that shape you most deeply are usually not removed instantly. They stay long enough to expose what is happening inside your heart. They reveal how much control you truly have over your thoughts, your fears, your sense of security. And this is where the struggle becomes deeply spiritual. Because many people think faith means never feeling fear again. But often, faith is choosing to keep bringing your fear to God instead of letting fear pull you away from Him completely. There is a major difference between struggling and surrendering to hopelessness. A struggling heart still reaches for God. A hopeless heart stops seeking Him altogether. That means your repeated prayer may reveal something more beautiful than you realize. It may reveal that your heart has not stopped trusting entirely, even in the middle of exhaustion. The Bible consistently presents prayer not as a one-time transaction, but as an ongoing relationship, again and again. Scripture speaks about seeking, asking, knocking, continuing, remaining, abiding, enduring. Not because God is distant, but because relationship itself is continuous. Real relationships are not built through one conversation, and your relationship with God was never designed to survive on one prayer alone. Yet somewhere along the way, many believers started treating prayer almost like a spiritual formula. Ask once correctly, and then never revisit the issue again. Or it means you lack faith. But your actual experience exposes how unrealistic that idea is. Because pain does not disappear instantly. Waiting does not feel easy. Fear does not always leave quietly. And the human mind does not automatically become peaceful simply because you prayed one prayer. Sometimes you pray sincerely in the morning and still feel anxious by evening. Not because your prayer was fake. Not because God rejected you, but because spiritual growth is often slower and deeper than immediate emotional relief. And this is important to understand. Recurring prayer does not always mean recurring doubt. Sometimes it means recurring surrender. Every day, your heart must decide where it will carry its burden. Toward fear, toward control, toward despair, or back toward God again. That daily returning matters more than you think. Because there are two ways a person can respond to ongoing uncertainty. One response is to slowly close off emotionally from God, to stop praying because disappointment feels too painful, to become numb spiritually because waiting feels endless. The other response is to keep coming back honestly, even while confused. Not perfectly, not confidently, every time, but consistently. And consistency is often misunderstood, because it looks less dramatic than instant miracles. Yet spiritually, there is something powerful happening every time you return to God instead of fully withdrawing into fear. Even if your prayers sound repetitive, even if your words feel weak, even if you feel emotionally tired, you are still turning toward Him. And maybe that matters more than you realize, because the enemy of faith is not always fear itself. Sometimes it is isolation. Sometimes it is the belief that you should stop bringing your struggles to God altogether. That is why shame around prayer can become so dangerous. If you become convinced that God is irritated by your repeated prayers, eventually you stop being honest with Him. You begin carrying burdens alone that were never meant to stay trapped inside your own mind. And once that happens, fear grows louder. Anxiety grows heavier. Overthinking becomes constant. Silence feels colder. God feels farther away. Not because He moved away from you, but because shame convinced you to stop approaching Him freely. But what if God never intended prayer to function as a performance of emotional perfection? What if prayer was always meant to be a place where struggling people return honestly, repeatedly, daily? Because the reality is this: some burdens are not lifted in one moment. Some seasons are not resolved quickly. Some answers unfold slowly. And during those seasons, the heart naturally keeps reaching for reassurance, strength, wisdom, peace, and hope. That does not make you spiritually weak. It makes you human. And perhaps one of the greatest lies exhausted believers carry is this idea that God is more impatient with their struggles than He actually is. You may be frustrated with yourself. You may feel tired of your own thoughts. You may feel embarrassed by how often the same fear returns. But what if God sees your repeated prayers differently than you do? What if He does not hear annoying repetition, but a child continuing to return to the Father because somewhere deep inside, they still believe He cares? That possibility changes everything. Because maybe the real issue is not whether you are praying too much. Maybe the deeper issue is that you still do not fully understand what God is doing during the waiting itself. Waiting changes people, not only externally, but internally, in ways they often do not notice at first. When a prayer remains unanswered for a long time, something begins happening beneath the surface of your faith. At first, you think the greatest challenge is simply enduring the situation itself, but eventually you realize the heart of battle is often what the waiting is doing to your mind. Because waiting has a way of exposing everything. It exposes your fears. It exposes your need for control. It exposes the places where your peace depends on circumstances more than you realized. It exposes how quickly anxiety rises when life feels uncertain. And if you are not careful, you can begin interpreting God's silence through the lens of your emotions instead of through truth. That is where discouragement quietly grows. The human heart naturally assumes that silence means absence. If someone stops responding to you, you assume distance. If someone remains quiet during your pain, you assume disinterest. So when heaven feels silent, part of you automatically starts wondering whether God has stepped away too. But silence and absence are not the same thing. This is one of the hardest spiritual truths to fully believe during painful seasons. Because when you cannot see movement, your emotions often conclude that nothing is happening at all. Yet some of the deepest work God does happens beneath what you can immediately see. Think about how much of life develops invisibly before it becomes visible. Roots grow underground before fruit appears. Healing happens internally before strength returns. Transformation begins quietly, long before outward results become obvious. Spiritual growth often works the same way. But waiting challenges your trust because your mind wants evidence now. You want clarity now. You want relief now. And when those things delay, fear starts creating its own explanations. Maybe God forgot. Maybe this prayer does not matter. Maybe nothing is changing. Maybe I will always feel this way. That internal spiral becomes exhausting because the mind does not stay neutral during uncertainty. If truth does not anchor your thoughts, fear usually will. And this is why repeated prayer matters more deeply than many people realize. Because prayer is not only about asking God to change circumstances, prayer is also where your mind keeps returning to truth before fear completely takes over. Every time you pray again, something important is happening spiritually. You are refusing to let fear become your only conversation partner. Even if your emotions still feel heavy, even if your understanding still feels incomplete, even if the answer still has not arrived, you are still turning toward God instead of fully surrendering to despair. That matters. But waiting rarely feels meaningful while you are inside it. Most people only understand certain seasons after they have passed through them. While you are in the middle of uncertainty, it simply feels uncomfortable, confusing, and emotionally draining. And maybe that is where you are right now. You are tired of carrying unanswered questions, tired of hoping and then feeling disappointed again, tired of trying to stay emotionally steady when your heart feels fragile underneath it all. Sometimes the exhaustion is not even caused by the original problem anymore. It is caused by the constant mental battle surrounding it. You wake up thinking about it, you go to sleep thinking about it, you replay conversations in your head, you imagine worst-case scenarios. You try to predict outcomes you cannot control. And somewhere inside all that mental noise, your soul becomes weary. But what if waiting is revealing something you would not notice otherwise? What if God is not only concerned with the outcome you are praying for, but also with the condition of your heart during the process? Because there are certain things comfort can hide. When life feels stable, it is easy to assume your peace is strong, but uncertainty reveals where your true security rests. Waiting exposes whether your hope depends entirely on immediate answers or whether your trust can survive even when clarity delays. That does not mean God enjoys watching you struggle. It means He sees beyond temporary relief. You often want God to remove the pressure immediately. But sometimes God uses the pressure to reveal what has been controlling you emotionally for years. Maybe the waiting is exposing how deeply fear has shaped your thinking. Maybe it is revealing how much your identity depends on outcomes. Maybe it is uncovering how quickly anxiety controls your inner world when certainty disappears, not to shame you, but to heal you. And healing is not always instant. That is difficult for modern minds to accept because we are conditioned to seek immediate resolution, immediate answers, immediate peace, immediate results. But spiritual maturity usually develops slowly through repeated surrender over time, one honest prayer at a time, one fearful night at a time, one decision to trust again at a time. This is why persistent prayer can become transformative even before circumstances change. Because every time you return to God, your heart is being shaped, not perfectly, not all at once, but gradually. You are learning endurance, learning dependence, learning honesty, learning that faith is deeper than temporary emotional confidence. And maybe one of the hardest lessons of all is realizing that God's silence does not automatically mean God's rejection. Silence can feel deeply personal when you are hurting. The mind quickly interprets delayed answers as disapproval or distance. But throughout Scripture, some of the people closest to God also experienced seasons where answers unfolded slowly, not because God abandoned them, but because timing, growth, preparation, and deeper purposes were unfolding simultaneously. The problem is that waiting rarely explains itself while it is happening. You want understanding before trust, but often trust must come before understanding. That is what makes these seasons spiritually refining. You continue praying, even without complete clarity. You continue seeking God, even when emotions fluctuate. You continue bringing Him the same burden because deep down, despite your fear, you still believe He is able to carry what you cannot. And maybe that repeated return is not evidence of weak faith at all. Maybe it is evidence that your soul still knows where hope is found, even while your mind struggles. There is also something else happening during persistent prayer that many people overlook. Prayer slows the spiral of isolation. When pain stays trapped only inside your thoughts, fear expands rapidly. The mind becomes an echo chamber of anxiety, assumptions, and worst-case scenarios. But prayer interrupts that isolation by bringing your internal struggle into relationship with God. Even when your prayers feel repetitive, even when your words feel simple, even when all you can say is, "God, I still need you." Especially then, because prayer is not merely information transfer. God already knows your need. He already understands your fear. The purpose of prayer is deeper than updating heaven about your circumstances. Prayer keeps your heart connected to God while life remains uncertain. And maybe that connection is more necessary during waiting seasons than you realize right now. Because one of the greatest dangers is not delayed answers, but slowly allowing disappointment to convince you to stop drawing near to God altogether. One of the quietest shifts that happens during long waiting seasons is this. Prayer can slowly stop feeling relational and start feeling transactional. At first, you may not even notice it happening. You still pray. You still believe in God. You still ask sincerely, but somewhere underneath your words, an expectation quietly forms. If you pray correctly enough, consistently enough, faithfully enough, then eventually the outcome should arrive. And when it does not, disappointment begins attaching itself not only to the situation, but also to your relationship with God. That disappointment can become deeply confusing because you genuinely love Him. You are not trying to manipulate God. You are not demanding perfection from life. You are simply hurting, waiting, hoping. But the human heart naturally drifts toward transaction when pain lasts too long. If I trust enough, God will fix this. If I pray enough, the answer will come. If I surrender correctly, the fear will disappear. And when the timeline stretches beyond what you expected, prayer itself can start feeling emotionally complicated. You continue talking to God, but now frustration quietly sits underneath the conversation. You wonder why the breakthrough has not happened yet, why the healing still feels incomplete, why peace still comes and goes, why the burden keeps returning after so many prayers. And eventually, if you are not careful, prayer starts becoming more about achieving relief than remaining connected to God Himself. This is one of the deepest tensions believers experience during prolonged waiting, because there is nothing wrong with wanting God to move. Scripture encourages bringing requests honestly before Him. The problem begins when your sense of security becomes entirely attached to how quickly circumstances change. That is when disappointment starts shaping your view of God. Without realizing it, you begin evaluating His closeness based on visible outcomes. If the answer comes quickly, you feel seen. If the answer delays, you feel uncertain. If silence continues, you begin questioning whether God still cares with the same tenderness you once believed He did. But relationship with God was never meant to rest entirely on immediate results. Real relationship continues, even when emotions fluctuate, even when understanding feels incomplete, even when the future remains unclear. And perhaps this is what waiting seasons slowly reveal. Whether your connection to God can survive moments where control disappears. Because prayer is not meant to function like a spiritual vending machine where the correct actions guarantee immediate visible rewards. Prayer is communion. It is returning, remaining, abiding, opening your heart honestly before God again and again. Not because He needs reminders, but because you need relationship. And maybe this changes the way you see repeated prayer entirely. What if God never viewed your repeated prayers as interruptions? What if He sees them as invitations into deeper dependence? Think about how often your repeated prayers happen in moments where you feel emotionally weak. You pray when fear rises unexpectedly. You pray when anxiety returns at night. You pray when uncertainty overwhelms your thoughts. Again, you pray when discouragement grows heavy. Those moments reveal something important. Your heart still instinctively reaches toward God when life feels unstable. That instinct matters more than you realize, because many people slowly drift away from God during painful seasons. Disappointment hardens them. Silence discourages them. Delayed answers convince them to emotionally withdraw. Yet despite your confusion, despite your exhaustion, despite your questions, you are still coming back. Even if your prayers feel messy, even if your emotions feel inconsistent, even if you sometimes wonder whether your faith is strong enough, you are still returning. And perhaps the greatest transformation begins there, not in pretending you no longer struggle, but in learning to bring the struggle honestly into relationship with God instead of hiding it behind spiritual performance. Because God has never required you to approach Him pretending to be unaffected by pain. He already knows your thoughts before you speak them. He already sees the nights He already understands the fears you try to suppress. He already knows how many times your heart has broken over the same burden. Nothing about your repeated prayers surprises Him. Sometimes people imagine God growing impatient the way humans do. Human patience often wears thin because human understanding is limited. People become frustrated repeating the same conversations because they tire emotionally, misunderstand motives, or lose compassion. But God is not limited by emotional exhaustion the way people are. His patience does not operate like human impatience. And this matters deeply because many believers secretly project human reactions onto God. They imagine Him sighing every time they bring the same request again. They imagine disappointment in His voice. They imagine Him thinking, "Why are you still struggling with this?" But what if that image of God is completely distorted? What if God sees your returning prayers through compassion instead of irritation? A loving father does not become angry because his child keeps coming close during fear. The repeated return itself reveals trust. It reveals dependence. It reveals that the relationship still matters. And maybe this is why prayer was never supposed to be reduced to merely obtaining answers. Because if prayer only matters when circumstances change, then your connection to God becomes unstable whenever life remains difficult. But if prayer is relationship, then even waiting seasons become places where intimacy deepens. Not easy places, not comfortable places, but meaningful places. Places where you slowly learn that God's presence matters even before outcomes shift. This does not mean the pain instantly disappears. You may still long deeply for the answer. You may still feel emotionally tired some days. You may still wrestle with overthinking and uncertainty, but gradually, something begins changing underneath the surface. You stop seeing prayer merely as a way to escape discomfort. You begin seeing prayer as the place where your restless heart keeps returning to God Himself. And that changes the emotional atmosphere completely. Because now, when fear rises again, prayer is no longer evidence of failure. It becomes evidence that your heart still knows where refuge is found. When anxiety returns, you no longer have to shame yourself for needing God again. You begin understanding that dependence is not weakness in the kingdom of God. It is actually part of spiritual maturity. The mature believer is not someone who no longer needs God daily. The mature believer is someone who has learned to keep returning honestly to Him, again and again, day after day, fear after fear, prayer after prayer. And perhaps that is why repeated prayer has always been part of genuine faith, not because God is difficult to convince, but because the human heart constantly needs reassurance, surrender, renewal, and truth while living in a broken and uncertain world. You were never meant to carry your burdens once and then never need God's comfort again. You were meant to live close to Him. And maybe the repeated return of your prayers is not revealing God's frustration at all. Maybe it is revealing your soul's ongoing need for communion with the one who has never stopped listening. There is something deeply human about returning to the same prayer. The mind naturally circles around unresolved things. That is how people are wired. When something remains uncertain, painful, or unfinished, your thoughts revisited repeatedly. You replay possibilities. You imagine outcomes. You search for reassurance. And if the burden touches something deeply important to your heart, it becomes almost impossible to simply stop thinking about it. This is especially true when fear is involved. Fear does not disappear because you decide it should. Anxiety does not permanently leave because you had one peaceful moment in prayer. Emotional wounds do not instantly heal because you sincerely trusted God yesterday. That is why daily surrender becomes necessary. Not because God failed the first time you prayed, but because the human heart needs continual renewal. Many believers become discouraged because they think recurring struggles mean their previous prayers did not count. They assume that if anxiety returns, they must not have trusted God properly. If fear resurfaces, they assume their faith was incomplete. If the burden feels heavy again tomorrow, they conclude they are spiritually weak. But spiritual life has never worked that way. Even your physical body requires daily nourishment, daily rest, daily breathing. Why would your soul never need daily returning? The truth is, dependence on God was never supposed to be a one-time event. It was always meant to become a continual posture of the heart. And maybe that is why repeated prayer is often misunderstood. People sometimes imagine spiritual strength as emotional independence. But biblical faith is not independence from God. It is deeper dependence on Him. That changes everything. Because now, returning to God repeatedly is no longer proof that you are failing spiritually. Instead, it becomes evidence that your heart continues seeking Him instead of surrendering entirely to fear. Think about how easy it would be to stop praying altogether, to become bitter, to emotionally disconnect because disappointment feels safer than hope. Many people quietly do exactly that, not always intentionally. Sometimes discouragement slowly closes the heart over time. The unanswered prayer becomes too painful to carry openly before God anymore, so they stop bringing it honestly. Outwardly, they may still believe, but inwardly, they retreat into emotional distance. Yet you are still returning, even while exhausted, even while confused, even while wondering why the answer still delays. Something inside you still reaches toward God. That reaching matters more than you realize. Because every time you pray again, you are making a quiet spiritual decision. You are refusing to let fear become the final authority over your heart. That does not mean you suddenly feel strong every time you pray. Sometimes your prayers are fragile. Sometimes they are tired. Sometimes they are filled with tears, uncertainty, and mental exhaustion. But weak prayers do not scare God away. In fact, some of the most honest prayers are born precisely in moments where you finally stop pretending to be emotionally strong. And maybe that is where real dependence begins. Not when you appear spiritually impressive, but when you recognize how deeply you actually need God. There is a reason repeated prayer often intensifies during difficult seasons. Pain strips away illusions of control. It reminds you that no amount of overthinking can fully secure the future. No amount of worrying can guarantee outcomes. No amount of emotional self-protection can remove uncertainty from life completely. Eventually, your soul reaches the limit of what self-reliance can sustain. And that is often where deeper surrender quietly begins. Not dramatic surrender, not perfect surrender, daily surrender. The kind that wakes up anxious and still chooses to pray. The kind that feels discouraged and still whispers, "God, I need you again today." The kind that keeps returning even when answers remain incomplete. This kind of persistence is not weakness, it is endurance. And endurance is one of the clearest signs that faith is still alive underneath the struggle. Because faith is not measured only by moments of confidence. Faith is also revealed in continued dependence during uncertainty. Anyone can feel secure when life makes sense, but returning to God while still confused that reveals something deeper. It reveals trust that survives unanswered questions. You may not feel courageous when you pray the same prayer again. You may feel embarrassed, tired, repetitive, emotionally drained. But heaven does not evaluate your prayers through the lens of performance. God is not listening for polished perfection. He listens to hearts, and a heart that keeps turning toward Him, despite fear is not failing Him. It is seeking refuge in Him. This becomes especially important when dealing with recurring anxiety or recurring emotional battles. Many people expect spiritual growth to eliminate struggle immediately, but often growth looks more like learning where to carry the struggle when it returns, because some fears return repeatedly. Some wounds heal gradually, some seasons stretch longer than expected, and during those moments, your greatest spiritual victory may simply be refusing to carry the burden alone. That changes the meaning of repeated prayer completely. You are not reinforming God about your problem. You are resurrendering yourself. Every repeated prayer becomes another moment where your heart says, "I still need you. I still trust you. I still believe you are near, even when I do not fully understand. I refuse to let fear isolate me from you." There is something profoundly beautiful about that kind of persistence, even if it feels ordinary to you. Because heaven does not only value dramatic moments of faith, sometimes the quiet daily return matters deeply in the eyes of God. The return after disappointment, the return after emotional exhaustion, the return after another night of the return after hope felt weak, especially that return. And perhaps this is why Scripture speaks so often about perseverance. Not because God enjoys watching people struggle, but because endurance forms something stable within the soul. Repeated surrender slowly strengthens trust in ways immediate answers sometimes cannot. Not instantly, not painlessly, but deeply. Over time, you begin noticing subtle changes. The fear still appears, but it no longer controls you as completely. The uncertainty still exists, but it no longer destroys your peace the same way. The waiting still hurts, but you are learning not to face it alone. And sometimes the greatest evidence that God is working is not immediate external change. Sometimes it is the fact that despite everything, your heart still keeps returning to Him. Because without realizing it, persistent prayer has already been shaping you, teaching you honesty, teaching you humility, teaching you dependence, teaching you how to seek God not only for answers, but for daily strength itself. And maybe one of the biggest revelations waiting seasons eventually produce is this. The goal was never merely to get through life without needing God repeatedly. The goal was always to learn how to walk closely with Him through every recurring fear, every uncertain season, and every burden that drives your heart back into His presence again and again. Something is happening inside you even now. Even if you cannot fully see it yet, that may be difficult to believe, because your attention naturally focuses on what has not changed. The unanswered prayer, the open question, the uncertainty that still exists, the burden that still feels heavy some days. But spiritual transformation often happens quietly, very quietly, so quietly that while it is happening, you may think nothing is changing at all. This is one of the reasons prolonged waiting can feel so discouraging. Human beings tend to measure progress externally. We look for visible movement, obvious breakthroughs, immediate clarity, and when those things delay, we assume the entire situation is stagnant. But God often works deeper than circumstances first. Before external outcomes shift, He begins reshaping the internal world of the heart. And that process is not always dramatic. Sometimes it looks like this. You still feel fear, but now you pray sooner. Instead of spiraling alone for hours, you still experience uncertainty, but it no longer destroys your peace as completely as it once did. You still have difficult nights, but you recover faster because your mind has learned where to return. You still carry questions, but they no longer separate you from God the way they once did. Those changes matter. In fact, they may reveal that God has been working more actively than you realized. Because one of the deepest transformations persistent prayer produces is internal alignment. Slowly, gradually, your thoughts begin learning how to return to truth instead of remaining trapped inside fear. Not perfectly, not permanently all at once, but progressively. And maybe this is important for you to hear. Spiritual maturity is not the absence of struggle. It is learning how to bring your struggle into relationship with God consistently instead of letting it consume you in isolation. That means the returning itself is part of the transformation. Every time you choose prayer instead of hopelessness, every time you choose surrender instead of complete emotional shutdown, every time you turn toward God again instead of away from Him, something is being strengthened within you, even if your circumstances still look unfinished. This is why prayer cannot be measured only by whether the external answer arrives immediately. Sometimes the first answer God gives happens within the heart itself, not the final answer, not the full resolution, but the beginning of deeper stability, a quieter mind, a softer fear, a stronger and a deeper awareness of God's presence in the middle of uncertainty. Those things are not small, yet people often overlook them because they are still waiting for visible outcomes. And yes, it is understandable to long for those outcomes. God cares about your pain. He cares about the burden you carry. He is not asking you to stop desiring healing, breakthrough, restoration, clarity, or peace. But perhaps during this season, He is also teaching you something you could not learn any other way. How to remain close to Him, even before life feels resolved. That kind of closeness changes a person deeply, because eventually you realize prayer was never only about obtaining what you wanted from God. It was also about learning how to live with Him daily, to walk with Him through uncertainty, to depend on Him through weakness, to let Him reshape the way your mind responds to fear. This matters because recurring anxiety often trains the mind toward panic and control. The human brain naturally searches for certainty to feel safe. So when answers delay, your thoughts race ahead, trying to predict outcomes, prepare for disappointment, or protect yourself emotionally from future pain. But persistent prayer slowly interrupts that pattern, not by removing every fearful thought instantly, but by teaching your heart where to go when those thoughts appear. And over Chini, something beautiful begins happening. Your reflexes change. Instead of immediately collapsing into despair, you begin turning toward God more quickly. Instead of believing every fearful thought automatically, you begin pausing and returning to truth. Instead of assuming silence means abandonment, you slowly begin learning that God can still be present, even when life feels unclear. That transformation is profound, because circumstances may still be developing, but your inner foundation is becoming steadier. And perhaps this explains why some people emerge from long waiting seasons with a deeper peace than they had before the trial even began. Not because the process was painless, not because they enjoyed uncertainty, but because repeated dependence taught them something about God. they could not have learned through comfort alone. They discovered his patience, his consistency, his nearness during weakness, his willingness to listen repeatedly without rejection. And eventually, they realized something that changed the way they viewed prayer forever. God was never merely tolerating their repeated prayers. He was meeting them inside them. Think about how many times you have approached God feeling emotionally exhausted, only to leave prayer slightly calmer than before. Maybe the problem itself remained unresolved, but something inside you softened. The panic loosened slightly. The heaviness became more bearable. Hope returned just enough for another day. Those moments are not meaningless. They reveal relationship. They reveal that prayer is not simply about transferring requests upward. It is also where God continually ministers strength, perspective, comfort, and endurance into the human heart, even when answers remain incomplete. And perhaps that is why Scripture repeatedly invites people not only to pray, but to continue praying, because continual prayer keeps your heart positioned near the source of peace while living in a world filled with uncertainty. Without that returning, fear grows louder. Without that returning, isolation deepens. Without that returning, disappointment hardens the soul slowly over time. But persistent prayer keeps reopening the heart to God's presence again and again. That is not weakness. That is survival for the soul. And maybe you have been more transformed by these repeated prayers than you realize right now. Maybe the very thing you thought was evidence of weak faith has actually been strengthening your faith quietly underneath the surface, because now you understand your need for God more deeply. Now you recognize how fragile control really is. Now you know where to go when fear rises. Now you are learning that peace is not found in perfect certainty, but in continued closeness to God. That lesson changes everything, especially when you finally realize this. The goal was never to become someone who no longer needs to pray repeatedly. The goal was to become someone who never stops returning to God, because they have discovered His presence is safe, patient, and sustaining through every season of waiting. So now the question returns one last time. Does God get tired of hearing the same prayer? And after everything you have walked through internally, the answer becomes clearer. No, God is not frustrated by your repeated prayers. He is not disappointed because your heart still needs reassurance. He is not annoyed because you continue returning with the same burden. He is not pulling away because your fears sometimes revisit you. If anything, your repeated prayers reveal something profoundly important. You are still turning toward Him, even tired, even confused, even emotionally worn down, even while waiting. That is not failure. That is faith enduring. Maybe not the dramatic kind people often celebrate publicly. Not the kind that always sounds fearless and confident, but the quiet kind, the honest kind, the kind that keeps whispering prayers through uncertainty because somewhere deep inside, the soul still believes God is listening. And perhaps that is what persistent prayer has been teaching you all along. Faith is not pretending the burden no longer hurts. Faith is continuing to bring the burden to God instead of surrendering completely to fear. You never needed to become emotionally unaffected to be accepted by God. You never needed to stop feeling weak in order to approach Him honestly. You never needed perfect peace before coming into His presence again. The repeated return itself matters, because every time you came back to God, you were choosing relationship over isolation, trust over complete despair, hope over total numbness, even on the days when your faith felt small. And maybe now you can finally stop condemning yourself for needing God repeatedly. Of course you need Him repeatedly. You are a human. Life is uncertain. The future is not fully visible. The mind becomes tired. Fear sometimes rises unexpectedly. Pain sometimes lingers longer than expected. None of that shocks God. He understands your frame completely. He knows how fragile the human heart can feel during waiting seasons. He knows how easy it is for anxiety to grow when answers delay. He knows how desperately people search for reassurance when life feels unstable. That is why He continues inviting you closer, not pushing you away. Closer with your questions, closer with your exhaustion, closer with your recurring fears, closer with the prayers you thought He might be tired of hearing. And perhaps this changes the entire atmosphere of prayer for you moving forward. Now prayer no longer has to feel like a test you are failing. It becomes refuge again. A place where you can speak honestly. A place where you can lay down fear repeatedly without shame. A place where your soul learns, over time, that God's patience is greater than your weakness. That realization brings peace in a way immediate answers alone sometimes cannot, because circumstances may still take time. Some prayers may still unfold slowly. Certain answers may still remain unclear today. But now you understand something deeper than you understood before. God's love for you is not measured by how quickly outcomes change. His presence remains steady, even in the waiting. And maybe for the first time in a long while, you could stop interpreting silence as rejection. Maybe you can stop assuming your repeated prayers make God distant. Maybe you can finally breathe again knowing that returning to Him daily is not spiritual immaturity. It is exactly where you were always meant to live. Close to Him, dependent on Him, honest before Him, sustained by Him, one day at a time. This does not mean every emotion suddenly disappears. Some days will still feel difficult. Some nights may still feel long. Fear may still try to revisit your thoughts from time to time. But now you know what to do when it happens. You return again. Not because God forgot your prayer. Not because you are failing spiritually, but because relationship with God was always meant to be continual. Daily grace, daily surrender, daily closeness, an overchimi, that repeated return produces something beautiful inside the soul. A steadier trust, a quieter fear, a deeper endurance, a confidence that God's patience is not fragile. You stop seeing yourself as someone begging an irritated God for attention. You begin seeing yourself as a child, continually welcomed by a loving Father. That changes the way you carry your burdens, because now, even while waiting, you are no longer carrying shame alongside the prayer. You understand that persistent prayer is not evidence of broken faith. It is often the language of enduring faith, the kind that survives uncertainty, the kind that keeps seeking God during silence, the kind that refuses to let disappointment fully separate the heart from His presence. And maybe that is the transformation your soul needed most. Not merely the removal of every burden immediately, but the discovery that God remains patient, attentive, and near through every repeated prayer you bring before Him. So tonight, tomorrow morning, or whenever fear returns again, you do not have to hesitate before praying. You do not have to apologize for needing God again. You do not have to feel ashamed because the burden still feels heavy. You do not have to wonder whether heaven is tired of listening. You can simply come honestly, again and again. And each time you do, remember this truth. God is not counting how many times you have prayed about it. He is responding to the heart that continues turning toward Him. If this message spoke to where you are right now, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments the prayer you are still trusting God with. Sometimes, simply admitting that you are still praying is itself an act of faith. And wherever you are in your waiting season, may you remember this quietly but deeply. The God who hears your first prayer is still listening to your latest one too.